Hi, buongiorno. Good morning. My name is Mark Battaglini. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer for the Alliance for Regenerative Medicine. I have the privilege today to have a fireside chat with Brunetta. He's one of the original board members for the Thalassaemia International Foundation. Thank you for joining us today. I wanted you to start by giving us a little bit of background, but what's important for this conversation also, Loris, is to give us an understanding of you're a patient and the patient journey that you've been dealing with.
Yes, Mark, thank you, and thank you for the invitation. I'm very proud to join this kind of level of conversation. Yes, I told you yesterday, I'm a patient. Actually, I'm a person with thalassemia, one of the 7,000 persons with thalassemia living in Italy, actually, because, you know, thalassemia is endemic here in the Mediterranean areas. And I'm 61, and I have to say that, so when I was born 61 years ago, also the mechanism of the disease were not well understood from the scientists. So I have to say that I grew up together with the scientists, all together exchanging since when I was a child, exchanging information about how is the life with thalassemia and knowing something about the science, even though in pediatric age allow both the scientist and the clinician to progress. Today, everybody knows that thalassemia has a good standard of care, particularly in the Western countries, in the developed countries. But crossing the Mediterranean, going to Africa or to Morocco, just to make an example, thalassemia is still the disease, life-threatening disease that was 50 years ago in Italy and in US and in developing countries. It was not easy to live with this disease, particularly in the 60s and early 70s, until the first breakthrough that was the introduction of the possibility of chelation therapy, the first drug for iron chelation. It was particularly useful for the patient and for the survival of the patient. From that moment on, the quality of life improved. And now, as told, I'm 61. I'm the living example that it's possible to thrive with this disease and to try to live a life with a good quality. I'm representing here the Thalassaemia. You mentioned the Thalassaemia International Federation. You know, I was a founding member in 1986 of this federation that have the scope, the aim to diffuse the knowledge of this disease all over the world, because what's not so treated and even known in the Southeast Asia or in countries very full of this kind of patients, this kind of gene mutation. It's a monogenic disease, so it's not difficult to target also for the gene therapies or for the advanced therapies. But in some countries still lack knowledge of the standard of treatment. So, you know, we rely on regular blood transfusions, and there are many countries in the world where blood safety is still an issue. So we are here to speaking about the Atmps, while I'm thinking that in many countries of the world, patients die in late infancy or during the adolescence. And so for this reason, establishing this organization, the TIF, the idea was to improve the access to the high quality treatment for for all the patients all over the world.
Yeah, and my experience with TIF over the years, Lourdes, has been extremely knowledgeable in educating patients, but also being a serious advocate in moving policies forward on this. I want to give the audience some context of this talk a little bit, and if we go to the next slide, Jancy. So there has been a number of significant events relating to ATMPs over the last 2 to 3 years. And there's been, I think, a lot of evidence of promise. Limeldi was approved in the Irish Bellulex Consortium just fairly recently. Vertex was approved by EMA Casgevy for beta thalassemia just a few weeks ago also. But at the other hand, there's been some huge disappointments. One is the exit by Bluebird Bio at the time was leader in gene therapy back in 2021 from Europe after Zynteglo, which was for beta thalassemia, was approved in 2019. There's been a recent policy mandate through the joint clinical assessment. You heard a panel on that went in great detail about what occurred regarding the coordination group and basically disregarding single Lamar studies in evaluating relative clinical effectiveness. Where are we? I mean, there's a lot of conflict here, a lot of conflicting messages. What's your thoughts on where the ATMP landscape is going?
Yes, what you mentioned about Zynteglo, it's particularly disappointing for the patient, as I had also an experience as member of the Committee for Orphan Drugs at the European Medicine Agency. And I joined the COMP in 2018 during the phase of discussion for the marketing authorization for Zynteglo. So being an expert of thalassemia, I was immediately involved in the scientific advice and in all the procedure, the protocol assistance that we provided to Bluebird Bio to develop the treatment. So, of course, it's not possible to disclose something that, is still under protection. But I have to say that I pushed a lot in order to, get the approval of this treatment, because even for a subset of patients, you remember it's been approved for non-beta 0 patient. Now, that is a subset of thalassemia patient. Was a very promising treatment, and we have been waiting for gene therapy. I'm listening. I've been listening, talking about gene therapy since early 80s. At the meeting for thalassemia at the time when we had still a lot of problems for the standard treatment, for the current treatment, we already talked about gene therapy as a perspective for the future. So now, having seen that this product is available, it could be available for a number of patients with, don't forget, thalassemia is still a rare disease at European level. So targeting a rare disease, a subset of patients with the rare disease, so you can imagine, everybody was happy to, and saw with great enthusiasm the approval of Zynteglo. Unfortunately, there are many considerations, and I have to say also that the regulatory process was clear and transparent, and I think the EMA provided all the possible help to develop the drug. The problem started after the approval, because and still with this new HTA regulation, but the remit of the reimbursement and pricing is still on the end of the member states. And so discussing at the level of member states is something that maybe it's not easy. Not everybody feels the same about the diseases. And despite the great knowledge people have about thalassemia, particularly in Italy, also in Italy the process was very slow for the approval of this drug. And this was reflected also at European level. At the end of the day, despite the product has been licensed by the EMA and the European Commission, at the end of the day, the long-lasting procedures or discussion for the negotiation of the price probably hampered the possibility for the patient to access the drug. Yeah. Because at the end, the company decided to withdraw from the European market.
Let me ask you this question. Do you think the HTA process is becoming more politicized? And let me give you an example from a former developer's perspective. You see some significant policies coming from the Commission. Back in 2 years ago, they passed the European Union HTA regulation, which the premise was be expedite drugs to the market. It was to alleviate the fractured natures of the HTA process, all for the benefit of patient access. This last month, you saw a communication released by the Commission on their biotech initiative, where they plan on developing a biotech sector, and also one of the main pillars of that is enhancing patient access. At the same time, you get what we see with the coordination group, where they're disregarding single MR studies. I mean, is it politicization of the HTA process?
Yeah, I think it's a difficult topic to discuss. From my perspective, of course, what the coordination group of the HTA stated is very concerning from my point of view. But I think we need to have different consideration, to make some consideration before discussing. Of course, from the patient's perspective, any legislation, any initiative that aim to facilitate the access for the patients to medicines are welcome, of course. And the aspiration of any patient is to be cured, is to be treated. And we know that there are a lot of diseases, rare diseases, ultra-rare diseases that have no treatment options so far. So it's important for to implement any kind of initiative that can facilitate the access. Having said this, of course, concerning the HTA coordination group, I hope this goes in the direction of the new pharmaceutical legislation and the idea that is in the mind of the Commission to facilitate the access. So facilitate the access means not to hamper the possibility of development from the companies, development of the products, and also do not pose too much hurdles on the pathway of the approval from the payers. So at the end of the day, I hope this statement of the coordination group is not something, it's a rigid rule to follow in any case, because of course it's difficult to think that for rare or ultra-rare disease you can use randomized clinical trials. It's difficult to think to have two arms of patients that are 4, 5, 6 in Europe. So it's not reasonable to think that these rules will be applied rigidly. I think flexibility is always, also when we approved Zynteglo, based on few data, on patient data, of course, and on single-arm trial, we were aware of the fact that this is a rare disease and it was not possible to propose a randomized clinical trial for that. So at the end of the day, I think it's difficult, but we hope as a patient that I see a bright future for these treatments because I'm quite optimistic to consider that the strategic line indicated by the European Commission will be followed from all the organizations at European level.
Yeah, so you're suggesting that common sense will eventually prevail.
Yeah, I think so. Even though otherwise there will be a contradiction between the idea of the European Commission to foster the development, particularly in those areas where there is a higher medical needs, like ultra-rare diseases, and these rigid rules that cannot be flexible and for the different situation. So I don't think, or now we are waiting for the elections, the European elections with the new European Commission, probably, but I don't think the line will be so much different from the past. So there is a clear contradiction if you try to facilitate from one side and from the other, you hamper the development and the access to the patients.
Yeah. I'm just going to pause for 1 second to see if there's any questions from the audience. Loris, I think they're in shock and awe over this exchange at the moment. So while they're thinking through that, let's talk a little bit about how do patient organizations, how do developers enhance the legitimacy of single-arm studies through real-world evidence, for example. What are your thoughts on that?
I think patients should be involved in any process that concerns the lives of patients. In everywhere, patients should be involved. Now we are in a different era of the patients. Once during the time of the paternalistic medicine, the patient was only the target of a treatment without any possibility to discuss or to interfere with the process. Mm-hmm. Now the patient is in a different position, is generally well educated and well equipped, very knowledgeable about his disease. I'm speaking of the expert patient living in Western countries, mainly in the developed countries, of course. In developing countries, it's completely different. But anyway, we are part of any discussion at regulatory side, in discussion with the companies. We are here to discuss in this context. It is completely different from what I am used to. I try to train the patients, to equip the patient, to educate the patients to become advocates for themselves. But now the patient is in the position that should be involved everywhere. And so we also, during the European Commission consultation for the pharma legislation, for the HTA, there are something that sparked a debate, the definition of unmet needs, high unmet medical needs, what is the difference between the two. In the HTA, we talked about the single arm and the randomized clinical trials. I think if the patient organization and the expert patients are involved since the beginning also in the trial design, would be very helpful also for the companies and for the regulators, because also for setting the endpoint, it's important to stress what matters to the patients. Sometimes during the clinical trial, and when I was at the comp at EMA, I saw a lot of applications and dossiers presented by the company. And sometimes I have been very critical with the companies because for the way they presented the data. I think they have to collect endpoint that matters to patients before. In this case, I think also the process of, for the regulatory, for the process of approval, and also the process of discussion and negotiation of the price can be facilitated. Because we know that the patient's perspective and the patient's preferences are included in the evaluation. Otherwise, it's difficult. And I had experience with many dossiers where the companies collected data of quality of life for the patients during a clinical trial. But hardly this data have been considered at the time of marketing authorization because the risk of bias or because the regulators don't know exactly how the data have been collected, which kind of surveys, which kind of patients answer the surveys. There are many uncertainties that I think can be clarified very easily, involving the patient since the beginning.
Is there any amount of data that you think will get the health technology assessors over the hump on uncertainty as it relates to single-arm studies?
Now we are talking a lot and we listen a lot of talking about real-world evidence that are particularly important in the case of single-arm trials. Just to make an example, why do not use real-world evidence? There is a lot of investments also from the European Commission, set a very interesting platform for registry for rare diseases, just to make an example, because the lack of registries means lack of data, and lack of data means that is much more difficult for the regulators to have comparative data for the products. So it's important to implement these registries and collecting real-world evidence, in collecting patients' preferences. At the EMA, we are working on a project for developing the PED, patient experience data. Everything is useful for the purpose of facilitating the access and accelerating the process. I think this investment from the European Commission for the European Registries for Rare Diseases in the context of the European reference networks, that is, from my point of view, it is the best legislation implemented by the European Commission from DG Sante in the last decade. I think it was very important because creating network of reference centers and allowing in certain situations, certain case, for the patient the cross-border healthcare, so the possibility to traveling across Europe for being treated, it's a huge achievement for Europe. Because as told this morning, maybe Europe, we say European Union, but it's not so it's so united at the moment.
Yeah.
So we need to work on it.
Is there, from your experience, is there one country that has the best practices that can be transported from a pan-European perspective as far as registries are concerned?
Well, in this case, my landscape was quite limited because, I'm much more focused on my disease. Speaking about my disease, of course, the countries where thalassemia and hemoglobinopathies in general, or sickle cell, are endemic are the Mediterranean countries. So just to make an example, we have a very good registries in Greece, just to make an example, very useful, for the patient. We are speaking of more or less 4,500 patients with thalassemia living in Greece. We are trying to implementing, but it's not so easy, implementing a registry also in Italy. Actually, we have the legislation. The registry has been already approved, but we need to populate the registry according to also to the GDPR, so there is something to adjust, but we are going to have this, hopefully this registry is also in Italy, have been recently issued a legislation that create a network between, among all the centers for thalassemia and hemoglobinopathies in general. So I think this can push also the population of the registry. I know in the north of Europe they are very good in working on this side, in Germany and in Sweden, but in completely different environment, also from a cultural point of view.
Yeah. We have about 3 minutes left. Anyone from the audience have any questions? Yes, sir. With the box.
Going back to the overhang from HTA, I guess it's difficult for me, I'm sure for others, to ignore that there's another set of policies, whatever you want to say, that are being formed. That's going to be another barrier that the countries basically can say, well, that's fine, but we're going to do our own thing. If you look at the passion for this group on science and trying to cure people, there's a reluctance not to say that the HTA process is also a formal way of saying no. From the standpoint that if you can't meet this barrier, you're not going to get funding. You're not going to get the exposure, and there's some other diseases that are getting a lot of exposure and a lot of funding. So if you ask yourself, does that not also impact the big white elephant in the room, the limited amount of funding and where it can go as some of these others like the GLPs, things come through the marketplace and take up a lot of funding. So if you look at the HTA process, and I'm somebody who's trying to get my technology funded, with a lot of uncertainty, you know, the financial people are off the stage now, but how do you avoid not saying to yourself, what additional barrier have you created during this period of uncertainty to allow the science to flourish? Because where's the funding going to come from? And that's when I was glad that you brought it up, but I didn't think we brought closure to that in terms of the impact that it continues to have. So I don't know if you want to have any more dialogue on that or not. I know you've tried to ask the gentleman to make comment on it, but it seems to be a huge elephant in the room that everybody's trying to avoid, but I think it's going to have a major impact on the funding going forward.
Maybe put a simpler way is, how do you get the HTA assessors to play by the rules that are set by the commission?
It's $1 million question. I think I can go back to the Z-integral affairs, just to maybe, I'm not sure to have captured the question, but in anyway, going back to the Z-integral, the situation was that and I consider also the patient organization, the patient, we were not able to highlight sufficiently the burden of the disease for any patient. And from the company or not the company, but the scientists, the problem was that they tried to highlight that this treatment was for everybody. Like they are doing now for CRISPR-Cas, Cas-GV in the last. I think these are mistakes. First of all, because not all the patients could be treated with gene therapies. Of course, in Italy we are 7,000. I'm 61. I don't think to have the criteria for being treated with gene therapy. But in any case, the information that circulates among the patients and the patient's organization is that everybody can be treated. And this is a mistake, because this scares the payers.
Right.
Who can think, in a market like Italy or like the Southern Europe, where we have 5,000 patients in Greece, 1,000 patients in Cyprus, 7,000 in Italy, how can you think that the national budgets can afford this kind of expenses for all the patients? So we need to be reasonable also in proposing ourselves for the discussion. I think going back to the HTA assessment and the rigid rules, they are trying to be rigid in public manifestation. And let's see what's going to happen during the discussion and the open dialogue that we hope to have. They are rigid because probably they see too much, enthusiasm, too much interest in this kind of therapies that are very expensive and will not be possible to make everybody happy.
Yep.
Providing the treatment for all. And so I think what is important is what I've said yesterday. Atmps for many rare diseases are today a reality. Please make everybody all together an effort in order for these treatments not become a privilege for some rather than accessible for all. Yeah. Otherwise, the innovation is justified if everybody can benefit from it.
Yeah. And that's one of the things
that... Otherwise, it's not an innovation.
Yeah, that's one of the things ARM is trying to tackle. Tim Hunt's introduction yesterday was addressing that as another other challenges. I could go on for another half hour, maybe an hour with you. I want to thank you very much for everything. And just over the past 2 weeks, getting to know you and talking about this talk was really energizing. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Lars.
Thank you. Thank you all for the invitation.